Hello, political science. This is Mr. Stark. Today we are going to finish up the PowerPoint on politics across borders. Last class we talked about the three ways in which they do peaceful interaction across borders, that being diplomacy, international law, and now international organizations, which when you think of international organizations, the one that probably comes to mind or should come to mind is the UN, United Nations, formed after World War II to try and assure that World War III never happens. In that regard, they have been successful. Although, as we've seen just from studying Rwanda and Somalia, they've had many other failures as well. They are a mixed organization with a mixed record. Avoiding wars is one in which they have avoided the big one, but there have been many other wars that have cost millions of lives that they have failed to intervene, or their intervention has failed to stop the war. But in many other ways, the United Nations has done a lot of very positive things. The World Health Organization, which is a wing of the United Nations, is on the front lines of the coronavirus epidemic, as well as many other epidemics in the past. They provide vaccinations, they provide medicines, different testing, expertise throughout the whole world for medical care, especially for the lower income areas of the world. They also have done quite a bit on sustainable agriculture, as well as addressing the issues of climate change, and coming up with what's considered basic human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. There's a video that I will post in the future that talks about some of the many hats that the UN wears, many of which you might not even been aware of. This is the bureaucracy, or how they're divided into four groups: the Security Council, the Secretariat, General Assembly, which is over 190 countries a member of that, and then the International Court of Justice, which I briefly talked about already. The last way in which countries do business or deal with each other across borders, well, international organizations, but another type is non-governmental organizations. This is the second type of international organization, and these are people that are not representative of their countries. So private individuals and groups belong to these, and there are thousands of them out there. I guarantee you've heard of some of them. But they provide information, they promote public policies, not unlike interest groups, and they also provide services that otherwise may be provided by governments, but they also are a viable alternative to governments, or when governments cannot provide those services, they step in. If you look at the picture here, just a few, so the Red Cross, Red Crescent, that's the full name for what is often known as the Red Cross. You have Catholic Relief Services that receives hundreds of millions of dollars. You have a group called Save the Children, which is, again, fights for children's rights, both health and otherwise, throughout the world. Amnesty International gets a lot of attention. Greenpeace, an environmental group, gets a lot of attention as well. So they can be any number of causes. And the last international organization, they are multinational corporations. Now they are actually interested in profit. The NGOs, non-governmental organizations, most of the time they're certified non-for-profit organizations. They don't pay certain types of taxes. They're given tax breaks. Multinational corporations are the massive corporations that exist for profit, but they also, because they have headquarters and factories and offices in many countries, they're sort of de facto international players. If, for example, if you look at some of these, if just choosing one, we have Quaker Oats. They're located in Colombia. If you're stationed in Colombia as a part of Quaker Oats, you know the people, you know the government, you know how it works. And so if there's a crisis between the United States and Colombia, our government and even the Colombian government might be calling on you or Quaker Oats to sort of be a middleman or a broker for some sort of peace. So it's not just profit because they're located in so many different countries. They also act as international actors as well. They're very powerful. Um, some of the larger ones that you've heard of, you have Exxon, which is now ExxonMobil. They combined to form a huge oil conglomerate. British Petroleum, Samsung, a couple Asian ones you can see there as well. And those are the international organizations, and that concludes the three ways that countries do relations with each other peacefully. Now we come to what's called power politics. Um, Basically, this is what happens when diplomacy fails. When the three organizations we talked about, whether it be diplomacy, international law, or international organizations, fail, and so things become a little more hostile, a little more aggressive, or in some cases, a lot more aggressive. Um, you have what's another name that I haven't mentioned yet, but you might hear on the news is soft power. This is the idea that to influence other countries to do what you want or to do things that are beneficial for your country, for your people, you need to have or lead by example. You need to convince them through your own positive behavior or through rational discourse, not simply, showing up with, for lack of a better term, a bunch of battleships at your back, as Matthew Perry did with Japan in the 20th, or I'm sorry, the 19th century. So it's basically a way of trying to convince other countries, foreign actors, to do your bidding through non-overtly hostile or through threats. Um, but we live in an increasingly globalized society. Soft power does not always work, and therefore other means of dealing with convincing foreign actors are oftentimes done. For example, you have what's called domination and dependence. It's the capacity of one state to alter the actions of another state. Could be through force. It could be, and might not be through overt military force. There really are three types. You have economic, military, and political. So economic, if you remember the documentary we watched in economics, Poverty Inc., that fits right in with this. How in many ways, large European and Western organizations, like the World Bank, the European Union, International Monetary Fund that offers loans to impoverished countries, those loans are sometimes used as a way of controlling those countries because those countries in Africa can't afford to pay back with large interest rates, and so they become economic slaves to the European or Western powers, a form of imperialism, as we talked about. But before we talk about that, we have to go back to the I would say good old-fashioned, but there's nothing good about it, the old-fashioned colonialism, where it's done by military force. This is the map of Africa. You can see on the left how it was carved up. After 1914, the European powers pre-World War I got together and decided how Africa was going to be carved up. The one group that was not invited to the party was the Africans, and a lot of the issues that happened are still a problem today. As you can see, they're mostly carved up on the right there according to the different resources that were there. Now, what I was referring to before is neo-colonialism. This is not really like sending military troops like British Isles did to India, the Bahamas, other areas they colonized, or the American colonies. This is more done through economics, as I talked about. The idea of using economic loans or economic development as a pretense to have your involvement or even your domination in those countries. Uh, Globalization versus globalism. I'll let you go ahead and read the definitions. If you have any questions about those, let me know. Four types of globalism: economic, social, cultural, military, and environmental. We really don't have time to get into any of those, but again, each one, you can spend a whole course talking about them. You have the question we asked ourselves earlier this year: is globalization a positive development? It is a vastly complicated phenomenon. In one side, life-saving medicines, cures of diseases, vaccines for polio, measles, all kinds of antibiotics have been spread to different countries that otherwise would not have had them if globalization wasn't around. That's one side. But on the other side, paradoxically, you have viruses, such as what we're seeing now, unprecedented access to the rest of the world through globalization, through airlines, through trade, through policies that allow people to gain access to other regions of the world in a matter of hours. So again, there is almost contradictory forces at work, as it says there. And what we've seen is countries, that's what I mean by states here, really have less control over their own welfare, their own destiny, because we are so integrated as a world society. Countries that try to sort of back out and isolate themselves, North Korea probably comes to mind, are undoubtedly the poorest countries, the countries that don't have links in with the global markets. That is the way our global economy is now structured. And finally, there are three major trends post-Cold War in international relations. The hopes were once the Soviet Union fell, we could get rid of nukes, militaries would be able to disarm, get smaller, we'd have world peace. Unfortunately, fortunately, World War III never happened, but there have been many smaller conflicts that have occurred. Military power remains significant. It is said that the pen is mightier than the sword. Some people would follow up and say, well, the pen is mightier than the sword as long as there's a sword backing up the pen. Military power still remains a critical factor in international relations. Whether that's positive or negative, that's more of a normative issue. Really won't get into that right now. Still intense economic competition for resources within developed and developing countries. So even though colonialism is now generally frowned upon, rightfully so, we have neocolonialism through those different economic apparatuses we've talked about. And then finally, the state-centered system, where each country is sort of its own sovereignty, sort of they deal with what's in their backyard themselves. That idea is starting to become more of a transnational one, and we've talked about that. Hopefully you read the article about the UN's, what they call the responsibility to intervene, the R2I initiative, which means that it's the UN's responsibility to deal with something in another country's backyard if they won't deal with it themselves. And that is a movement from a state-centered system to what's called a transnational system, getting away from each country sort of being its own sovereign unit. By law, yes, but by practice, we're seeing a trend that's a little bit away from that. And then you have this term imperial corporations. So in a sense, imperialism is not done by countries, people of this view would say. It is done by corporations. Corporations who go into developing countries, set up polluting, low-paying jobs in factories, what they would call exploit the local people there in order to make more money, lower costs for their business. But which means, we talked about in economics, that means we in America can then spend less money on the goods that are shipped to us. So it's a very complicated and cost-heavy formula.